Now let's say that we are indeed looking at different species, and perhaps that they have somehow emerged from some speciation event. Perhaps it was branching evolution, or perhaps it was non-branching evolution. Whatever it is, one of the questions you may ask with some justification is, once you have these species, how come they don't go back to the way they were before? And so we have to figure out how species remain distinct. That's one key issue with macroevolution. Once it's macro, then the idea is that they don't go back to the way they were. In order to figure this out, we're going to look at reproductive barriers. There are, it turns out, features of organisms that prevent them from going back to becoming single species. Now, in some cases, I think that just the overall morphology can dictate whether it works or not. I mean, if you think of things that are perhaps closely related to us, Homo sapiens, which would include things like chimps and gorillas and orangutans and gibbons, right? Those are the tailless apes. There are morphological ways by which you can clearly separate each of these forms, and therefore, just by recognition, would we say, okay, we're not going to make a mistake very easily, right? Between us and chimpanzees, I think that's probably pretty obvious. So there are reproductive barriers before we even get started. But what if things are very similar? And in this case, one of the things that you can come up with is a series of barriers that start with pre-zygotic barriers. Those are barriers that occur before any kind of development can begin, before the zygote is formed. Now, if you remember, sperm and egg, they fuse, that's called fertilization, and the first single cell that exists with both of these genetic components is called the zygote. So the zygote is the departure point from which development then would produce the adults. And so what happens if there are similar organisms and they somehow find each other, but something happens to prevent their reproduction? What exactly could those kind of things be? So here we are, as a starting point, we have individuals of different species. Now, the way these are drawn is deliberate. They are both spheres, and these spheres only differ in color. So that means, sure, you could tell them apart, but only based on their color. Everything else is sort of uncertain. They look like spheres. They're the same diameter, right? So morphologically, it may not be so easy to tell them apart. Well, what keeps them from making successful offspring? There are 3 of these pre-zygotic barriers that happen relatively early in this process. The first of these is called temporal isolation. And temporal isolation simply has to do with timing. Timing in the sense that if things aren't ready to breed at the same time, then how can they breed? So perhaps you have one organism that is active during the day and another one that's active during the night. Well, reproductive activity needs both of these to be active at the same time. That never happens, therefore there is temporal isolation. Or perhaps, even though they're similar organisms, one type of organism breeds in the spring, the other organism breeds in the fall. Therefore, the timing is all wrong, and temporal isolation prevents them from mating. So timing, that's one issue. The second one of these is habitat isolation. Habitat isolation is simply a question of where do you live. Now clearly, if I live on an island and you live on the mainland, then we're not going to meet, and therefore we're not going to mate. So if there is habitat isolation in terms of geographic distance, well, that's kind of obvious for not getting individuals to mate. But what if they actually overlap geographically? That means you find a GPS coordinate and you say, okay, there's a tree at these coordinates and there are lizards on this tree, so I guess they might all be able to mate. But that's not necessarily so, because when you look at the distribution of certain types of lizards on trees, especially in the tropics, you may find that some lizards are hanging out and foraging right on the root material. And they have sometimes very big, extensive roots, these rainforest trees, and so there's a whole microhabitat right there, and that's where some of these lizards live. A different kind of lizard on the same tree may be only present in the foliage on top of the tree, in the crown of the tree. And so the two are busy with foraging in very different places. And in the middle there's this tall trunk of the tree, and they don't actually meet. One doesn't climb up far enough, the other one doesn't come down far enough, and so there is habitat isolation, and they simply don't meet. That's a habitat issue. Then you have behavioral isolation, where whatever set of behaviors is displayed by the one type of organism in order to get mating going, in order to elicit a response from the other, just isn't working. They don't know how to talk to each other properly. It's not a matter of language, sometimes it's a matter of displays, and the display of the one is not something that the other likes or can understand. An example for this would be the calls of different species of frogs. If you think of how frogs call, in some cases you'll find that there are subtle differences, and the females of each species is tuned only into the exact kind of frequency of sound that the male of the same species makes. And there's some really interesting examples where you have the trill of one species and the trill of another are both kind of recognizable, but they're not exactly the same. So you may have a toad trill like this. That's the trill of a toad. There's a North American toad that trills similar to that, and it lives in an area with a toad that trills also, but at a different frequency. And so there are differences between these that the human eye can detect. And so their behavior, therefore, attracts only the males and females, or rather the females of that species. But the problem is they both live together. And so under certain circumstances, mistakes are made. But more about that later. So behavioral isolation is something that can be very important in this. Now let's say that all of these work. So that means that the timing is right, they're reproductively active, the habitat is right, they are able to encounter each other, and the behavior doesn't really matter for whatever reason, then mating can take place. Well, even if mating takes place, what can then prevent the formation of a zygote? One of these things would simply be mechanical isolation. And mechanical isolation means that the reproductive structures don't work. This could be that two plants that are very similar have pollen grains that are too large for the other plant. Well, then mating can't take place. Or perhaps it is the actual reproductive structures. They just don't fit. The male and the female, they're not compatible. And so in each case, you would have mechanical isolation. I have to sneeze. So, the last thing that can happen is called gametic isolation. And gametic isolation means that even though the sperm and the egg can encounter each other, so the mechanics work, everything else is fine, and the sperm and the egg actually end up in the same environment, but the sperm cannot penetrate the egg because there's some chemical difference. It's sort of the barrier of last resort, if you will, where somehow the female and the male gametes are not compatible. So those are the pre-zygotic barriers, 5 different ways by which things might not work. Well, let's say that given the same species as before, we now look at gamete formation and zygote formation. So the gametes work together, the egg and the sperm, they meet up and they fuse. So now you have a zygote that's produced. And if fertilization happens, then there are still some barriers that might prevent the species from producing a viable hybrid. The first one, in fact, is called reduced hybrid viability. And that may mean that at any point after the zygote has formed, the embryo no longer develops. The genetic material is incompatible. This can happen sooner in development or later in development, but however it happens, you don't end up with a new organism. So hybrid viability means that the organism does not make it to sexual maturity. So whatever the offspring is, it's just not able to survive. Secondly, you can have reduced hybrid fertility. That means that even though you end up with a hybrid and it's an organism and the organism survives, it is not an organism that can itself produce new offspring. And that's reduced hybrid fertility. And then lastly, you may end up with something called hybrid breakdown. And hybrid breakdown is the kind of thing that you might see when two different species of toads interact. Because one of the things you can have in this situation is you can have the one kind of toad with a higher pitched call and the one with a lower pitched call that exists in the same area. You can have the female of the one species approach the male of its species, but along the way it gets waylaid by a male of the other species. Now this is very interesting. When I was a graduate student, we did research at a place in Ontario in Canada called Long Point. And at Long Point you have two species of toads breeding at the same time. And when toads breed, you'll find that the males and females have high levels of hormones, and it turns out that they're not very discriminatory when it comes to mating. So if you find a calling male and the male is really high on the hormones, you can put your shoe by the male and the male might grab the shoe trying to mate. So I mean, they're really not very discriminatory. And so when it comes to grabbing a female that just happens to walk by, but it's on the way to another male, the male, even though he's from the wrong species, doesn't recognize this and will try to mate. The female is similarly high on hormones, and she says, oh, okay, whatever. And so you end up with the mismatched pairing. Now, they were trying to find each other the correct way, but because they happen to be in the same place, two species, you can end up with hybrids. And in this case, these two species do produce hybrids. Not very many, but a few. So there's probably some reduced hybrid viability. There are perhaps some developmental problems. But every now and again, and we did this research, my former PhD supervisor has been doing this research now for almost 30 years, I think. He's gone back to that area, he's done the research on the toad, so he's found a handful or so of these hybrids, and you find that these hybrids exist, but they don't mate with anybody. They don't set themselves up right, and they don't sound right either. So if you have a trill like this, and the hybrid's in the middle. And it's, you see all these lonely little hybrids, and they're just sitting there away from everybody else, and they're not even hormonally engaged. So you put a shoe in front of that one, it doesn't react. It turns over and plays dead. So obviously this hybrid is defective, lonely and defective, and that's what we can consider hybrid breakdown. So the idea is that even though there are two species right there, and they are in the same place at the same time, and they're active, and they can sometimes breed together, they're still not producing fully functioning adults. Something happens and they're breaking down. Now, if the outcome is viable fertile offspring, at the end, then you don't have two species, because this is where the biological species concept would apply, and you would say, okay, that's it. Viable fertile offspring, therefore we shouldn't have considered them two distinct species in the first place. Now the examples for these are many. And some of the examples that the book gives us are really cool things. So the temporal isolation one, this is where you have different breeding seasons for these two species of skunks. So even if you didn't have a continental divide run through the middle of them and separate them into two populations, they are temporally isolated. Habitat isolation. And sometimes you find that a species is confined to ponds and lakes, and another one to the desert. Well, those two are not going to meet, are they? Behavioral isolation. The birds shown here are called blue-footed boobies. And these blue-footed boobies, as you can see, they have these nice little blue feet. And here you have on the left a male, and the male is actually in the process of performing a little mating ritual. It's kind of like a formalized dance, and you can see the female here is intently looking at him, and if he does this dance just right, then her hormones will start to operate, and then he can lead her away to the mating ritual. So this is sort of a little dance. This is kind of getting to know you, you know. And when all is said and done, and he puts the feet down just right, and she's not distracted by other birds flying by, then the two of them can move off, and only if the right dance is performed with the right timing, then will she actually be ready to mate. In some cases, you have mechanical isolation. In this case, mechanical isolation is interesting because here you have the reproductive opening of the one species. Here you have the reproductive opening of the other species, and because of the way they line themselves up with the way the shells are, left-handed, right-handed kind of shells, these actually can interbreed. Now, if you just looked at the shell, you'd say, yeah, it's the same kind of shell, but then eventually you'd realize if you line the two up, this shell has the whorl on the left, right? This one has the whorl on the right. This whorl is counterclockwise, this whorl is clockwise, and now you can start to figure out some other differences. So these are very similar clearly, but they are mechanically isolated. Then lastly, you have gametic isolation. Here you have two sea urchins. There is the red sea urchin, guess which one that is, and the purple sea urchin, guess which one that is. Now, these are both sea urchins. They both occur in the same place. For example, the waters of the Pacific Northwest, Monterey Bay, all the way up the coast. And so you have both of these come into their reproductive time at the same time. They live in the same place. They're surrounded by the same water. And the way they breed is they're sea urchins, right? So some people might say they breed very carefully. Well, yeah, that too, but they also basically interbreed by releasing eggs and sperm into the water. Well, if they're sitting like this, the way you see them in the picture, there is no separation. So how do you know which is the red sperm and which is the purple egg? You don't, but they do, because the red urchin sperm cannot penetrate the purple urchin's egg. And even though they're very similar and live in the same place, you don't actually get hybrids because gametic isolation works. You don't end up with hybrid sea urchins. Post-zygotic barriers are a little harder to find and are also a little harder to define. And here are examples. There on the left, there's a salamander. It produces hybrids, and these hybrids tend to die relatively early and therefore are not going to have offspring of their own. Everybody's probably best known one is the horse and the donkey, right? Those are the parents, and the outcome is the mule, and the mule is sterile. Mules don't produce eggs and sperm. And so these are two species, and even though mules are strong and they can become adults and they can reach a ripe old age and they can pull your cart up and down the Grand Canyon or whatever, these are not organisms that themselves can interbreed. So it's a dead end here. And then another example of hybrid breakdown here with two species of grasses. This is one species, and this is the other species, and here you have the hybrid, and the hybrid just doesn't work. Even though it exists, even though it produces seeds, these seeds just don't work. And so you end up with hybrid breakdown. So there are very distinct ways by which species stay apart. So going backwards in terms of evolution, going backwards once you've gone past the point of microevolution is not something that happens in nature.